The door of number 14 Grosvenor Place closed before Henrietta Wendwood had fully descended the area steps. And the sound it made was not a slam, but something quieter. The soft, definite click of a thing that has been decided long before the moment of its deciding. She stood on the bottom step and counted to 3. The January wind came off the square in gusts that smelled of coal smoke and horse dung. And somewhere behind her, on the frozen cobbles, a carriage was turning, its iron wheels ringing on the stone with a high, bright sound that carried all the way to the iron railing she gripped with one bare hand. 3 seconds was enough. She was 24 years old, and she had been counting since she was 17, since the morning the solicitor arrived with his leather case and his careful expressions, and the Wendwood house in Surrey began its long journey out of the family's hands. She looked at the letter in her other hand, her own letter, the one she had spent 3 evenings composing by a candle that had cost her more than she cared to calculate, returned to her still folded, with no seal broken. Mrs. Grimshaw had not even read it. Henrietta had watched the woman's mouth tighten the moment she'd seen the paper, watched her set it aside with the particular courtesy of a person who has already made up her mind, as though the name Wendwood were a word in a foreign language she had no interest in learning. She was a thin woman, Mrs. Grimshaw, with colourless eyes and a set to her jaw that suggested a lifetime of saying no with great efficiency. Henrietta put the letter into her pocket. She would use the back of it for something else. Paper was not cheap. This had been the last house on the list. Not the last possible list. She was still capable of constructing new ones, but the last she had built out of the names she'd known in her father's time. The houses where the name Wendwood had once meant something other than ruin. She had gone through those names with the same systematic patience her father had once brought to his accounts, sitting at his desk in the lamplight, with his hands moving over the columns, as though the numbers were a language he trusted, even when it frightened him. She could still see those hands, the ink stain at the base of his forefinger, the way he pressed each entry firmly, as though weight on the page could steady it. He had been a careful man. He had not been careful enough. The street around her was as indifferent to her situation as streets generally are. A sweeps boy came around the corner, carrying a bundle of straw larger than himself, squinting against the wind. A coal cart went by, with a driver who looked at nothing. The frozen cobbles had a thin skin of frost over them this morning, pale and almost pretty in the hard white light. And the carriage she had heard turning behind her was now standing still. She noticed it because it was very still. Horses move even when stopped. They shift their weight, they blow, they pull at their bits. These did none of that. They stood with the docility of animals well cared for, warm under their blankets, waiting with neither impatience nor complaint. The carriage itself was dark painted and plain, with no crest on the door and no footman visible. And then there was a footman, because a man in plain dark livery stepped down from the back with the unhurried precision of someone who has done this 10,000 times and crossed the pavement toward her. He was perhaps 40, with a face that gave nothing away, and he held in one hand a folded letter closed with a plain wax seal, no device pressed into it. "Miss Wendwood," he said. She nearly told him he had the wrong person. It had been some time since anyone had said her name that way, with the quiet certainty that she was someone worth finding. "Yes," she said. He held out the letter. The seal broke cleanly under her thumb. 3 lines, written in a compact, unhurried hand. "A post is available at Old Croft in Kent for a person of education and good judgment. Terms are generous. If you are willing to present yourself at this address, my carriage will bring you there this morning. L." That was all. No explanation of the post, no description of the household, no condition, no threat, no apology. She read the 3 lines twice and then looked up at the footman, whose name she did not yet know. "Whose carriage is this?" she asked. "His Grace of Lynwood," he said, in the same tone he might have named a street. She had heard the name Lynwood. Everyone had heard it, in the way that one hears the names of things that are spoken about rather than to. The Silent Duke, people called him, though the precise nature of his silence was never quite the same from one telling to the next. One version had him mad with grief. Another had him simply rude. A third, offered in drawing rooms with a certain pleasurable gravity, suggested that he no longer spoke at all, had not spoken in years, since something had happened at Old Croft that no one would name directly. What united all 3 versions was the air of absolute finality with which they were delivered, as though the Duke of Lynwood were a chapter that had closed, and whatever he had once been was now purely a matter of record. She looked at the plain, dark carriage, at the patient horses, at the footman who was waiting without any appearance of impatience. She had no list left. She had 3 shillings and 4pence in her purse, a single change of linen in her bag, and the brooch her mother had pressed into her hands 2 years ago, with the instruction that it was hers to keep. She had sold it 3 weeks before to a man on Wardour Street who had given her exactly half what it was worth, and she had taken the money without argument, because half was what she had. The indentation where the clasp pin had caught on the lining of her cloak was still there. She did not look at it. She folded the letter along its original creases and put it in her pocket alongside the returned application. "I am willing," she said. The footman's name she learned only as he handed her up into the carriage, and gave a small, correct inclination of his head, was Jenkins. He did not say anything else. The carriage moved. Inside, it was warm. Not the moderate warmth of a well-built vehicle, but a considered warmth, as though someone had arranged it specifically. There was a rug folded on the seat beside her. Thick wool, dark blue, placed with the intent that she might want it. She did not unfold it for the first quarter hour, and then she did. And she did not examine too closely why the deliberateness of its placement had given her pause before she accepted it. She watched London give way to the Eastern Road through the window glass, the familiar clutter of streets thinning to frozen fields and bare hedgerow. She held the 3-line letter in her lap and tried to understand what she was moving toward. She came to no conclusion. She tucked the letter into the inside pocket of her cloak, next to her chest, not from sentiment, but because it seemed the safest place for a document she might eventually need. Old Croft arrived in the late afternoon. She had expected something large and cold and abandoned, the way that great houses sometimes fall when their masters fall with them. What she found instead, coming through the gate and into the stone courtyard in the low amber light of January, was a house that had clearly been looked after by someone who cared not about impression, but about function. The Kentish stone was grey and low, the facade unpretentious for its scale, and from a dozen chimneys the smoke rose in straight, vertical lines against a sky that had gone the colour of pewter. Light showed in every window, not the staged light of a house staffed for a visit, but something steadier, accumulated, lived in. Mrs. Ashby was waiting in the entrance hall, a round-faced woman in her 50s with worried eyes and the demeanour of someone carrying a slightly larger number of concerns than she could comfortably hold, but holding them steadily. She said that Miss Wendwood's room was prepared, and dinner would be at 7 if it suited, and asked whether she had eaten since London, and when Henrietta admitted she had not, a tray appeared in her room within 20 minutes, carried by a girl of perhaps 16, with a broad, honest face dusted with cold. "I'm Bessie, miss," said the girl, setting the tray down with the care of someone recently taught how. "I was told to say the fire was lit this morning, but it was His Grace who did it, not me. He came down himself before breakfast to see that the drawer was right. Henrietta looked at the fire. It was burning very well, even, consistent, the sort of fire someone has properly laid rather than hurried at. "Does he make a habit of that?" she asked. "Checking the fires for new arrivals?" Bessie considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Not for everyone," she said. "No, miss, not usually." She went away, and Henrietta sat before the fire that a duke had checked at dawn, and ate the dinner she had not expected. And she did not let herself think too carefully about either. The first full morning, she found the library by following the smell of it. Old leather, cold paper, the particular dry warmth of books that have been kept together long enough to develop a climate of their own. She had grown up in a house with a library. The sight of the shelves, floor to ceiling, running along 3 walls, a pair of tall windows giving cold north light onto the reading table, settled something in her that had been unsettled for a long time. She stood for a moment, simply breathing it, and then she began to walk the shelves. She was running her fingers along a row of spines when she became aware that the doorway behind her was no longer empty. He was taller than she had imagined, and younger, which was not saying a great deal since she had imagined nothing coherent. Dark coat, simply cut, no ornament. He stood with a stillness that was different from Jenkins's professional stillness. This was the stillness of a person who has learned to be careful with themselves, who has chosen not to take up more space than is necessary. His eyes were dark, and they were on her, and they held something she could not interpret. Not the proprietary assessment of an employer examining a new acquisition, not hunger, not judgment. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has returned from a very long absence. Whether she reminded him of someone, or whether he had simply been waiting that long for anyone to stand in that room and look at the books as though they deserved to be looked at, she had no means of determining. He did not speak. He crossed to the writing table by the north window, opened the small cedar box beside the inkstand, took out a card, and wrote in the same compact hand she recognized from the letter. He set the card on the corner of the table nearest her. Then he withdrew, without having made a sound beyond the soft, careful closing of the door. She picked up the card. "The library is yours whenever you wish it. Take any book you like. No one will disturb you here at this hour but me, and I will not." She read it twice, then a third time, because the grammar of it interested her. The way the last sentence offered and withdrew at once made a promise by distinguishing himself from it. A declaration framed as an absence. She turned the card over, but the reverse was blank. She put it in her pocket. She stood for a long time in the warm library of Old Croft, with a card in her pocket that told her she was safe, and the knowledge that the man who owned this house had lit her fire before anyone else was awake, and she tried to decide what kind of transaction this was. Not what it appeared to be, what it actually was, underneath. She could not decide. The warmth was freely given, and the fire was freely given, and the library was freely given. And that was precisely what she could not resolve. Because nothing given freely, in her experience, had stayed that way. And the kindness that named no price was always the kindness that required the most vigilance. The snow began that afternoon, light and unhurried, settling on the stone sill of the north window as she read. Lady Perseus, she learned from Mrs. Ashby at tea, would receive her tomorrow morning, and had strong opinions about the disposition of the parlour furniture that she was eager to share. The Duke of Lynwood did not return to the library. She did not hear him anywhere in the house. What she had still not been told, and had not yet found a moment to ask, was the name of the post she had been hired to fill. Lady Perseus received her at 10 o'clock in the south parlour, and the south parlour had been arranged around warmth rather than elegance, the furniture pulled closer to the hearth than propriety would normally encourage, a table within reach of the largest chair, bearing a tea service that had clearly been in use for decades, the silver worn soft at every handle, and the cream jug repaired once at the lip with a thin line of gilded lacquer. In the largest chair, upright in a manner that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with long habit, sat a woman who was very old and did not appear to find this inconvenient in the least. Lady Perseus Marlowe was 80, and she had the quality sometimes found in the very old of seeming to have arrived at an age beyond being surprised by anything, including the person now standing in her doorway. She was small, narrow-shouldered, dressed in layers of grey wool with a Norwich shawl across her knees in a pattern of dark blue and ochre, and she held in both hands a small, leather-bound volume with a brass clasp at its foredge, the kind used on older books when they were meant to be kept closed between readings. The clasp itself worn bright at the hinge with decades of handling. She was not reading it, she was simply holding it, the way one holds something that has been carried long enough to become part of the hand's ordinary weight. "You are younger than I expected," Lady Perseus said, in lieu of greeting. And Henrietta understood at once this was not a criticism, but the leading sentence of a longer inquiry. "I am 24, Henrietta said. "I know how old you are. My eyesight is imperfect, not my correspondence. Sit down, Miss Wendwood." Henrietta sat. The fire was warm at her left side, and the room smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. The lavender packed into small cloth sachets tucked between the cushions of each chair, releasing something faint and concentrated when pressed. She noticed, above the mantelpiece, a portrait. Not the formal, triumphant sort hung for public contemplation, but something smaller and more direct. A woman of perhaps 40 in a plain grey gown, painted with the attentive quiet of someone who had wanted a likeness rather than a statement. Dark eyes, a slight, deliberate calm in the set of the mouth. Looking at it, Henrietta had the brief, vertiginous sensation of recognising something she could not quite name. "That is my niece," Lady Perseus said. And Henrietta realised she had been looking for several seconds longer than was polite. "Lucinda. She died 11 years ago. In this house, which she loved." "I am sorry," Henrietta said. "You are polite. That is different from sorry, but I accept it." Lady Perseus set the leather volume on the table beside her with the deliberate care one gives to objects old and irreplaceable. "My nephew brought you here for a reason that is not the reason you were given." Henrietta kept her hands still in her lap. "I was given very little reason." "Precisely." The old woman studied her with the frank attention of someone who has long since stopped worrying about the appearance of frankness. "The post is real enough. The library wants cataloguing, and the household has been in a state of scholarly disorder I've been complaining about for 3 years without producing any remediation, largely because my nephew will not engage a stranger unless he has thought about it for an adequate length of time. He thought about you for some while." "He knew of me before the letter?" Henrietta asked. "He knew of your father." Lady Perseus turned the leather volume once in her hands and set it back. As a man of precise accounts and strict honesty in a period when both were rare, and as a man who suffered for it. Whether you knew this yourself is a separate matter. Henrietta had not known it. She sat with the information and felt it rearrange certain things, the warmth of the carriage, the folded rug, the particular care of the library card, the fire lit at dawn. A debt, then. Something owed by this house to the name she carried. To the man who had sat by his lamp pressing each column entry down as though weight alone could steady it. She had half expected something else, charity or worse, and debt was in many ways easier to hold. Debt had edges. You could see where it began and where it ended. What she had not yet been given was the origin, the amount, the name attached to it. She did not ask. Not from timidity, but because Lady Perseus had the look of a woman who releases information in its own order, and pushing would accomplish nothing except a demonstration of impatience, which she had no intention of making. "The cataloguing system," she said instead. "Is there an existing one?" Lady Perseus appeared to find this answer satisfactory. "There is a system my nephew imposed some years ago, which is both thorough and idiosyncratic. Mrs. Ashby can direct you to the notes. Whether it requires overhaul or continuation is a matter I leave entirely to your judgment." A brief pause. "He will not tell you himself. He doesn't tell anyone very much, at present." "I had noticed," Henrietta said. "Yes, he was not always so." The old woman's gaze moved to the portrait, a look so quick and habitual it was almost invisible, the reflex of long association. "He was, in fact, rather the opposite. You will hear a version of why from Mrs. Ashby, or Bessie, or any number of people who were here at the time. I tell you only that the version you will hear is incomplete. What is missing from it is the part that matters." Henrietta looked at Lucinda again, the dark eyes, the deliberate calm. She thought of the Duke's face as it had been in the library doorway, still in a way that was chosen rather than given, the stillness of a person who has decided to take up no more space than is necessary. "Was he close to her?" she asked. Lady Perseus looked at her for a moment, with something that was not quite surprise. "Yes," she said, very simply, and did not add to it. Mrs. Ashby arrived at 10:30 with the household account books spread across a wooden tray, apologising for their quantity in a way that made it clear she was rather proud of them, and the three women spent 2 hours working through the state of Old Croft's domestic affairs with the systematic attention of the genuinely practical. By noon, Henrietta had a working picture of the household. 7 indoor staff beyond Mrs. Ashby herself, a kitchen run by a cook named Mrs. Greaves with a local reputation for demanding the best of whatever the season offered and consistently achieving it. A stable yard with 4 horses and a boy named Tom, 14, willing and enthusiastic in ways not always aligned with safety. And a library that had not been properly catalogued in 15 years, because the last person who had understood its system had been the woman in the grey portrait. She did not say this to Mrs. Ashby, who had gone carefully neutral about the face when the library was mentioned. The way people go careful about rooms they still feel they are visiting rather than inhabiting. In the afternoon, she went down to the kitchen. Not from hunger, but from the knowledge that a household is understood by its kitchen before it is understood by its parlour. And Mrs. Greaves turned out to be a stout woman in her late 50s, with flour on her apron and a habit of speaking about ingredients with the affectionate specificity of someone recounting acquaintances. She was kneading a pastry crust when Henrietta appeared in the doorway, and made no apology for the fact, and no great alteration of her activity. "You'll be Miss Wendwood," she said, in the tone of someone who already knows what you are going to say, and is waiting politely for you to say it. "His Grace sent word this morning that I should ask your preferences in the matter of supper, which he has not done for any person before, so I tell you that in case it is useful to know." Henrietta said she had no strong objection to anything, and would be grateful for whatever the season allowed. Mrs. Greaves regarded this answer with mild suspicion, as though it were too convenient to be entirely honest, then nodded and returned to the crust. "He asked mine once," she said, not looking up, "about a spice I'd used, just the once, some years ago now. But he remembered the answer the next time it came up." She worked the dough with a steady, decisive motion. "He notices. That is what I'd tell you about him if you were asking." Henrietta thanked her and went back up through the servants' stair and stood for a moment in the upper passage with Mrs. Greaves's words sitting in her mind alongside Lady Perseus's, alongside the card, alongside the fire lit before anyone else was awake. And she tried, carefully and honestly, to assemble the shape of what they added up to. She could not, yet. But it was becoming a more specific uncertainty. The library in the late afternoon had the quality of a room that clears its own air as the light drops. She spent the remaining daylight hours not yet cataloguing, but reading her way across the shelves, taking down a volume from one section, then another, getting the measure of what the collection was. The natural history ran deep, the philosophy deeper, the poetry absent in the general way, and present in concentrated pockets, like clearings. 2 of the 3 shelves she had first taken for verse turned out to be music, manuscript scores, some in professional copyist's hand on good paper, and some in a hand she did not recognize, cramped and fast, with a quality of urgency, corrections running sideways up the margins and sometimes onto the back of the page. One sheet had been started, crossed through entirely with a single diagonal stroke, and then resumed on the reverse as though the first attempt had been the wrong key. She held it up to the remaining light from the north window. The hand was the same throughout the entire manuscript collection. The same hurried certainty, the same margin annotations, the same diagonal crossout that appeared perhaps a dozen times across a dozen different scores, as though it were a thinking motion, the pen moving when the mind was still working. Someone had composed a great deal, and done it in this room, and stopped. She was still holding the score when she heard steps in the passage. They came from the east end of the corridor, unhurried. A quality of silence preceded them, the settled silence of a person long accustomed to moving through a house without drawing attention. Outside the library door, they slowed, paused, stilled entirely for perhaps 10 seconds. The steps did not resume. After 10 seconds of silence, then 15, then 20, the door opened. He did not enter the room so much as arrive at its threshold, remaining in the doorway with the same quality of contained attention she had seen on the first morning, as though crossing a room uninvited required an internal permission he was still in the process of granting. His gaze moved from her face to the manuscript score she was holding up against the fading light, and something in his expression changed without exactly shifting. A tightening around the eyes, a recognition, followed almost immediately by its own suppression. She did not lower the page. She was not sure why. She was, she thought, usually more careful than this about the things she found in other people's houses. The care not to seem to have discovered more than she was meant to. But something about the score in her hand, the diagonal crossouts running up the margins, the hand moving fast across the page, with its particular mixture of certainty and revision, made her hold it steady rather than set it back, as though lowering it would be a more pointed acknowledgement than simply standing with it. He looked at the score for a moment longer. Then he walked to the shelves on the left side of the window, 4 long steps, unhurried, and lifted a flat wooden box down from the lowest shelf, a box of dark oak with a fitted sliding lid. He set it on the reading table and slid the lid open. Inside, the remaining loose scores were arranged in a single neat stack, edges aligned, no note of explanation. He held out his hand. She crossed the room and placed the score into his hand, careful not to fold the page. Their fingers did not touch. He set the score into the box, aligning its edge with the others, and then he closed the lid with the same deliberate quiet he brought to everything, and went out. She stood in the library as the last of the light left the north window, with the dark oak box on the table and its contents unknown to her now, and she felt no clearer about the shape of the thing she had walked into, only more certain that it had one. The ground frost held through the following week and the week after, locking the kitchen garden under a pale crust that crunched underfoot and did not soften until noon, if it softened at all. Henrietta had begun the library catalogue in earnest, working through the mornings with the Duke's existing system as her guide, a system of notation in 4 coloured inks that had seemed, at first reading, arbitrary, and revealed itself, on the 3rd day, to be rigorous to the point of obsession. Every cross-reference marked, and every addition noted with the precision of someone who considered provenance part of the book's meaning. She worked with it rather than against it, and she was a week in before she realised she had not encountered a single section she would have arranged differently. Mrs. Ashby had offered, 2 days after her arrival, to take her round the tenant farms on the estate's western edge when weather permitted. On a Thursday of relatively forgiving sky, they went out in the small gig. Mrs. Ashby driving with the competence of long practice, the lane frozen hard and the hedgerow on either side reduced to dark lacework against the grey. The third farm they stopped at belonged to a man named Corby. He was 67 or thereabouts, broad-shouldered in the manner of a man who had spent his life working and had simply compressed with age rather than diminishing. And he met them at the gate of his yard with the particular dignity of someone who has had occasion to be grateful and has thought carefully about how to show it without making it a performance. "You'll be Miss Wendwood," he said, pulling his cap. "From the house." He said it the way all the tenants appeared to say it, not as address or description, but as belonging. From the house, as though Old Croft were a fixed point in the county's moral geography. His barn had burned in November. Lightning strike in a late storm, the timber dry enough to go fast before anyone could do more than drive the animals clear. He had lost the structure entirely. He had not lost the animals. And by the time he had sorted out where he stood and begun to look at the cost of rebuilding, the timber had already arrived. Good oak, paid for, with a note that gave no name and bore only the Old Croft crest pressed into plain wax. "I went to ask His Grace about it," Corby said, looking at the frame of the new barn rising at the yard's east end, its pale wood sharp against the winter air. "To thank him properly. Mrs. Ashby will tell you what he did." "He listened," Mrs. Ashby said, in the steady voice of someone summarising something they have witnessed many times. And then he poured Mr. Corby a glass of the good Madeira, and they sat for half an hour. And at the end, His Grace stood and shook his hand and went back to his study. Not a word exchanged between them. Corby nodded, as though this confirmed something rather than left it unexplained. "He's a good man," he said simply, which was both insufficient and exact. Henrietta learned on the ride back that there were 7 other instances she did not yet know about: roofing, a medical debt, a daughter's passage to her husband in Edinburgh, a subscription to a school established for the estate's children that the Duke paid annually without appearing on its founding document. All of it moving through the estate accounts in Mrs. Ashby's careful hand. All of it traceable back to a word or a look from the man in the study that had communicated an intention without announcing it. "He does not wish to be known for it," Mrs. Ashby said. "He has made that clear enough without saying it." A pause as the gig rounded the last curve of the lane, and Old Croft's roofline came into view against the low sky. He made it clear in the usual way, by which he meant by saying nothing. The stable yard incident happened on a Saturday, without warning, in the way that the things requiring judgment always do. Tom, 14, willing, and possessed of a confidence in his own reflexes that had not yet been fully tested by consequences, had been asked to lead the grey mare, Constance, from the paddock to her stall before the afternoon's chill deepened. Constance was not difficult under most circumstances, but she had a sensitivity to sound that required patience, and Tom had rushed the gate latch, which produced a sharp metal ring that sent Constance sideways in 2 fast, startled steps that pulled the lead rope clean out of Tom's hands. He chased her across the yard. She was not going to run. She was not a horse who ran. But she was large and unhappy, and Tom's chasing was making her larger and unhappier. And one of the other stable hands had come out of the tack room to watch, with the expression of a man calculating how much trouble was accumulating. The Duke came around the corner of the stable block. He had apparently been returning from somewhere. His boots were cold muddy from the lower field, and he carried nothing, which was his ordinary state on the estate. He took in the scene without any visible acceleration of his attention, walked straight across the yard to where Constance had backed herself against the fence, and placed one hand flat against her neck. He stood there. Constance breathed hard. Once, then again, then slower. His hand did not move. He was looking at a point somewhere beyond the fence, not at the horse, not at Tom, not at the stable hand. And after perhaps 2 minutes, Constance was simply a horse standing calmly against a fence. And he turned his head and looked at Tom with an expression that was entirely without anger. Tom held the lead rope in both hands. His face had gone through several colours. The Duke extended his free hand toward the rope. Tom gave it. He handed the rope to the stable hand, who had the sense to take it without comment and lead Constance away. And then he remained where he was until Tom had gathered himself, which took a moment. And then he walked back toward the house, without looking at the stable hand, whose expression had suggested dismissal was being calculated. Henrietta had been crossing from the kitchen garden to the house, and had seen most of it from the path above the yard. She stood with her basket of cut lavender stalks, and watched the Duke walk back through the low gate, his boots still cold muddy, his face arranged in its ordinary careful quiet. He glanced up at the path as he came through. She did not look away, and neither did he. That evening she rearranged the dining room. It was not a large decision. The great oak table that had stood in the room's centre was simply too far from the hearth for comfort in this season, and the cold came through the east window at a particular angle that hit anyone seated at the table's north end directly in the back of the neck. She had noticed this at her second dinner in the house and had spent several days thinking about it, in the manner of someone who is considering whether a thing is hers to change. She decided, on balance, that her function in the household inclined her toward it rather than away. She asked Jenkins, whom she had found to be a man of practical intelligence, who preferred clear direction to elaborate request, to help her move the table 4 feet toward the fire. Then she set a wide bowl of the dried lavender she had cut that morning at the table's centre. Old-fashioned, perhaps, but the scent, when warmed by the fire's heat, would change the quality of the room's air in a way she had calculated based on the sachets in Lady Perseus's parlour. She replaced the wax candles in the candelabra with a softer cream variety, lower in the stick and marginally warmer in colour. The cold came through the east window exactly as before. The table, now moved, was simply somewhere other than in the line of it. She had dinner alone that evening, which was its ordinary arrangement. She ate well. Mrs. Greaves had produced a rabbit stew of unpretentious and complete excellence, and the bowl of dried lavender did what she had thought it would do in the warmth of the fire, and the room felt, if not yet entirely comfortable, at least as though it might be willing to become so. In the morning, she found a single card on the table beside her breakfast. The table suits better here. No initial this time. She set it with the first card in her inside pocket. 3 nights later, at 11:30, Bessie knocked at her door to say that Lady Perseus had taken a chill. It was not a serious chill in the dangerous sense, not pneumonia, not fever, not the kind of illness that rearranges a household's future. It was an old woman's chest, drawn tight by cold air she had encountered at the window she insisted on leaving open regardless of season, producing a rattling breath and a cough that woke Bessie in the adjacent room, and a restless wakefulness that Lady Perseus would not dignify with distress, but that nonetheless required company. Henrietta put on her warmest shawl and went in. The room was warm enough, the fire built up, the curtains drawn. The Norwich shawl she had noticed on Lady Perseus's first morning now tucked around her in the bed with the careful thoroughness of someone who had done it before. Lady Perseus was sitting up against her pillows with the leather-bound volume on the coverlet before her, and the expression of a person tolerating their own illness with the minimum of patience available. "I do not require attendance," she said, when Henrietta settled in the chair beside the bed. "I know," Henrietta said, and did not move. Lady Perseus studied her for a moment, with the sharp attention that no amount of chest cold had dimmed, and appeared to revise some assessment. "The lavender in the dining room," she said. "That was yours." "Yes." Lucinda used to bring lavender in from the garden in the summer. She dried it in the west passage. Lady Perseus was not looking at her when she said this. She was looking at the leather volume's brass clasp, her thumb moving once across it. "The house has smelled the same these 3 days. I noticed." Henrietta did not speak. The fire shifted. At some point past midnight, she was not certain of the hour because she had not looked at the clock and did not want the motion of looking to disturb Lady Perseus, who had drifted into an uneasy half-sleep. The door opened very quietly on its well-kept hinges. She had not heard steps in the passage. He had simply arrived, as he arrived at most things, without announcing his approach. He was dressed as though he had not been to bed. No coat, waistcoat still fastened, cravat loosened at the throat in a single pull. He took in the room in one look: the fire, the sleeping figure in the bed, Henrietta in the chair. And then he crossed to the far side of the bed and drew the second chair forward, the small rosewood one that sat ordinarily against the wall and had been, she would later think, placed there deliberately for some prior occasion that now repeated itself. He sat down. They kept watch together through the remaining hours of the night, he on one side of the bed and she on the other, with Lady Perseus between them, breathing in the rattled, gradually easing rhythm of a chest clearing itself. The fire needed tending at 2 o'clock and she rose to do it. He had been to the door and back by the time she turned around, having refilled the small pitcher of water on the bedside table, which had been nearly empty. Neither of them appeared to have discussed this division of attention. It simply arranged itself. Near dawn, the sky outside the curtain's edge, gone from black to deep grey to the colourless pale that precedes colour. Lady Perseus's breathing settled into something even and slow, and the cough was gone from it. The old woman's hands on the coverlet uncurled from their tight hold and lay open, the leather volume between them. Henrietta looked up from those hands. He was already looking at her. She had, in the preceding weeks, seen his face in library light and courtyard light and the flat white light of a winter afternoon. She had seen it carefully composed and carefully averted. She had not seen it in the unguarded, uncertain hour before first light, in a room where something had nearly gone wrong and had not, and where the sustained attention of the night had left no energy remaining for the construction of ordinary distances. He was not looking at her with the expression she had been cataloguing, not the recognition, not the careful withdrawal. He was simply looking at her, without architecture. And she found, quite suddenly, that she did not know what to do with a face that was not holding itself away from her. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked elsewhere. Outside, a thrush began somewhere on the east side of the house. A single repeated phrase, too early for the season, bewildered by a false warm front, calling into the grey as though it had already decided it was spring. Lady Perseus slept. The fire burned low and quiet between them, and the bowl of dried lavender on the mantelpiece sent its faint warmth into the air. And Henrietta sat with the knowledge that the house had shifted around her in this room. This hour was different in some proportion she could not yet calculate, and that what she did not yet know was not whether the debt was real. It was what had made it necessary to begin with. The estate in February moved at the pace of contained work, the kind of work that does not announce itself, but leaves evidence of having happened. Henrietta had completed the library's first 2 sections and was well into the third, and the catalogue she was building had developed a voice of its own, her own notations beginning to overlap and answer the Duke's 4-colour system in the margins, as though 2 people were conducting a conversation in the only medium currently available to them. She noticed when she had begun doing this, it was the 9th day, and considered whether to stop. She did not stop. The mornings had established a rhythm without either of them designing one. She arrived in the library at 8. He arrived at 9 or 9:15, or occasionally not at all. But when he did, he went to the writing table by the north window and worked in silence. And she worked at the catalogue shelves, and the silence between them was the kind that has its own texture, different in quality from the silence of an empty room. Once he left a note beside the inkstand directing her attention to a volume she had not yet catalogued, a second edition of a natural philosophy text with a correction in the author's own hand on page 47, which she found and examined with the care it deserved, and which she noted in the catalogue with a separate annotation in a 5th colour, her own red, since none of his 4 covered the category of authorial emendation. Whether he noticed the red, she could not say. He said nothing. 2 days later, she found 2 further volumes set out on the reading table with slips of paper at the relevant pages. She kept the slips. It was Mrs. Ashby who told her, on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of February, about the debt in its actual form. Not because she had not asked, on the principle she had established with Lady Perseus, that some information is best received in its own order, but because Mrs. Ashby had carried it long enough and had made the private decision that Henrietta had been in the house long enough to carry it too. They were in the linen room at the top of the east stair, folding the dried sheets, which was not a task Mrs. Ashby needed help with, but which Henrietta had taken to joining on Wednesdays, because the linen room was warm, and the conversation there was of a different quality from conversation in corridors or parlours. "You know about Sir Gerald Cranford?" Mrs. Ashby said. Not a question. "The name," Henrietta said. "Not more than the name." It took the better part of 2 sheets to lay out, because the whole of it was complicated by the particular complications of financial dealings among men who trusted each other's character more than they examined each other's arithmetic. The short version, the one that Henrietta assembled from Mrs. Ashby's longer, more careful telling, was this. Her father, Mr. Philip Wendwood, had been the principal creditor in a shared investment that Sir Gerald Cranford had structured in such a way that when it collapsed, the losses were attributed to Wendwood's management rather than Cranford's design. The documents that would have established Cranford's role had disappeared before any formal inquiry. Her father had died 2 years later with the charges still attached to his name, his assets dissolved, his reputation the only casualty that could not be itemised in a ledger. The Duke of Lynwood had been her father's closest correspondent in the last year of his life. He had seen the papers before they disappeared. He had been 29 years old and not yet the Duke, and he had been, by Mrs. Ashby's accounting, ill with the kind of illness that takes up a year and leaves the year behind it, permanently altered in its proportions, which was why he had not acted before the documents were gone, and why he had spent the decades since in the particular private company of that failure. "He does not call it a debt," Mrs. Ashby said, smoothing the last fold with both hands. "He has never used that word to me. But I have been in this house since before the old Duke died, and I know the look of a man carrying something he believes is his to carry." Henrietta stood with a folded sheet between her hands and felt the full architecture of it rearrange itself around her. The carriage, the folded rug, the fire lit at dawn. The library card, offered and worded as it was, "The library is yours whenever you wish it," with its particular grammar of restoration. The cataloguing work she had been hired for, which was real work and genuinely needed, but which had also been the vehicle for something else entirely. A way to bring the daughter of a wronged man into a house that could shelter her without requiring her to receive shelter as a gift, because her father's dignity had mattered, and his daughter's would too. She thought of the manuscript scores in the dark oak box, the diagonal cross-outs in the margins, the hand that had composed a great deal and stopped. She thought of what Lady Perseus had said. He was, in fact, rather the opposite, and of the portrait of Lucinda above the parlour mantel, and of the dark eyes in the portrait, and the question she had asked, and received its single-syllable answer. She said nothing to Mrs. Ashby. Mrs. Ashby, who had the tact of the genuinely kind, did not appear to require her to. She went directly to the library, not because she had intended to return to the catalogue, but because she needed the room. She stood at the north window and looked out at the bare garden, the kitchen wall, the elm at the garden's east end whose upper branches carried the first pale suggestion of something that was not yet a bud, but was considering it. She was not angry. She had tested herself for anger on the way up the east stair, in the way she had learned to test herself for things, the 3-count method, the same one she had used on the area steps in January, in an earlier life. And it was not there. What was there was something more complex and less easy to name. The particular clarity that follows the resolution of a long uncertainty, accompanied by the particular vertigo of discovering that the ground has been different from what you thought it was, and is also, upon examination, more solid. She thought about her father's hands on the account books, the ink stain at the base of his forefinger, the pressure he gave each entry, as though weight could steady it. He had been right, and he had died without the record reflecting it. And the man in the study below her had spent 10 years knowing that, and being unable to undo the knowing. She picked up her pen and went back to the catalogue. The first assembly of the county season was held in the last week of February at the assembly rooms in the market town 4 miles east of Old Croft, in a building that had been built for exactly this purpose in 1778 and showed it. High ceilings, long windows, a floor of broad oak boards worn silk smooth by generations of the county's best shoes, and a system of chandeliers that dripped wax with democratic impartiality on everyone below, regardless of status. Lady Perseus had decided she would attend, and her attendance was not negotiable, regardless of anyone's opinion on the subject, including her own physician's. Henrietta accompanied her, on the understanding that her role was to be useful rather than ornamental, and that Lady Perseus's idea of useful was primarily someone to talk to who would answer honestly. She had dressed in her best, which was a dark grey silk she had made over herself from a gown 3 seasons old. The cut altered enough to be current, and the colour unchanged, because she had nothing else to alter it to. She had no jewellery. The mother's brooch was gone, and its absence was a fact she had reached a working accommodation with. Though she was aware of it, as one is aware of a healed fracture in cold weather. In her hair, she had put a single pin of her own making, a piece of dark ribbon looped through a small button that had come from her father's old cabinet coat, ivory, with a thistle pressed into the face. It was not fashionable. It was hers. The assembly rooms were full. The county had a sociable winter and a long memory, and both were in evidence within the first 10 minutes. Lady Marchmont was a tall woman with a high-pitched carrying voice and the social instinct of someone who has never been required to consider the cost of what she says, because she has never been on the receiving end of it. Henrietta became aware of her within the first quarter hour, not by introduction, but by the kind of acoustic coincidence that places an unguarded voice just behind one's shoulder at the precise moment it is saying something it would prefer to say out of earshot. "They say the Wendwood girl is no better than she should be," Lady Marchmont was saying, to a small group whose response Henrietta could not see. "Living alone with that mad Duke, and his poor aunt a prisoner in the house." Of course, the Cranfords have known about the family for years. The 3 dowagers at the near end of the room cut Henrietta before the first set had finished playing. The cuts were of the accomplished, seamless variety that requires long practice, the eye that moves past you and settles on the wall beside you as though you are not quite there. The conversation that does not pause to include you because it cannot see you to pause for. 3 in succession, was thorough work. She felt it in the standard way, which was that she felt it and did not show it, and she carried Lady Perseus's shawl from one end of the room to the other, and kept her face arranged in its ordinary expression, which was composed and attentive, and gave nothing to the room that the room had not earned. Lady Perseus, from her chair near the fire, watched all of it with the expression of a woman compiling a list. Lady Marchmont has been saying unforgivable things about people at these assemblies for 40 years, she said, when Henrietta returned to her side. She has yet to face any consequence of substance. It may be accurate, Henrietta said quietly. Some of it, at least. About the family. Accurate in what way? Lady Perseus's voice was precise. My father lost his name here. She will not have forgotten it. Your father lost his name to a lie that was told by Sir Gerald Cranford, and has not yet been publicly corrected. Lady Perseus did not raise her voice, but it acquired a quality of compression that made it carry less than an inch and strike with considerable force. The two situations are not the same, and I want you to know that I know the difference, even if no one else in this room currently does. Henrietta looked at the chandeliers, wax pooling at the lips of the cups, the light making the old ceiling plaster gold and warm. Does he know, she asked, that it's being said? Linus knows everything that happens in this county that touches his house, Lady Perseus said. He has known for 2 days, probably. What he has not yet done about it is the more pertinent question. Linus. She had not known his given name. She filed it in the inside pocket of her attention, alongside the cards, alongside the slips of paper from the volumes on the reading table, alongside the way he had looked at her in the hour before first light, without the architecture of ordinary distances. She did not examine it further. Not here. Not tonight. The week following the assembly was quiet in the way of a room where someone has made a decision that has not yet been spoken aloud. The routine of the library continued. The morning silences continued. On the Thursday, she arrived to find a book left open on the reading table. Not one from the catalogue shelves, but a slender volume of poetry, its binding dark red and soft with age. Open to a page where someone had underlined, in the same compact hand as everything else, a single couplet. She read it twice, then a third time. She did not write anything in the margin. She closed the book carefully, aligned it with the edge of the table as she had seen him align things, and went back to the shelves. She said nothing. He was not in the room. She was aware, in the precise way of someone choosing not to examine an awareness too closely, that this was a communication, and that it had been left where only she would find it, and that the words underlined were not in any classification she had yet developed a colour for. 2 days after the assembly, she learned from Bessie, whose information networks within the house were comprehensive and involuntarily thorough, that a letter had arrived from London, addressed to His Grace, bearing a seal that Bessie described as a crest with a fox on it. She knew the crest. The Cranford crest was a fox, silver on blue. She had seen it on the gates of the house in town her father had gone to and never come back from with his name intact. She did not know what the letter contained. She did not know whether it was an opening or a provocation, a demand or a response to something the Duke had already set in motion. She knew only that it had arrived, and that Jenkins had brought it directly to the study, and that the Duke had been in the study with the door closed for the remainder of the afternoon. What she did not know, and what she would not know for several more days, was whether he was acting or whether he was still waiting for permission from himself to begin. The answer came, obliquely, on the 5th day after the letter's arrival. Jenkins had been to the post twice in 3 days, an unusual frequency for a household that received most of its London correspondence in the Friday packet, and the Duke had taken his meals in the study rather than the dining room, which Mrs. Ashby told Henrietta was something he did only when he was either thinking or not eating, and that the two conditions were often indistinguishable. She had seen him once through the open study door as she passed, standing at the window with his back to the room and his hands clasped behind him. And the set of his shoulders had the quality of a person not looking at anything outside the glass, but at something internal that required that particular posture to hold steady. She did not disturb him. She went back to the library and worked through 2 more sections of the catalogue and tried not to count the days since the fox-crested seal had been brought to his door. Lady Vivian Cranford arrived on a Thursday. She came in a carriage that was not plain. It had the crest on the door, silver on blue, the fox in a posture of arrested motion, that managed to suggest both elegance and cunning in roughly equal measure. And she descended it with the practised ease of a woman who has spent 30 years calculating the effect of her entrances and has long since ceased to need to calculate consciously. She was perhaps 50, though she presented herself as a decade younger, through the discipline of absolute composure. Smooth-faced, as the county described her, in the way of marble surfaces that are smooth because they have been worked, rather than because they were made that way. She wore grey, which was a deliberate choice in a woman of her means, grey that was clearly not economy, but statement, a colour that said she had chosen not to compete on the ground of display, and was therefore competing on other ground entirely. At her throat, a small cameo on a garnet chain, the carving a profile she had probably selected because it resembled no one currently inconvenient to resemble. She had sent no card ahead. She came as though she had every reasonable expectation of welcome, which was its own kind of statement. Jenkins brought word to the library, where Henrietta was cataloguing a section of botanical volumes with the calm efficiency that had become her morning's occupation. He said only that a visitor had called for Lady Perseus, and that Lady Perseus was receiving, and that Miss Wendwood might wish to be aware. Jenkins had the habit, she had come to understand, of compressing a great deal of editorial opinion into the spaces around what he actually said. The phrase, might wish to be aware, carried considerable weight in his register. She went down. Lady Perseus had arranged herself in the south parlour as she arranged herself for everything. Not to receive, but to hold ground. The leather-bound volume on the table beside her, and the Norwich shawl across her knees. The portrait of Lucinda visible at the edge of the room's sightline, as though it had been consulted and found steadying. She introduced Henrietta without inflection, as one introduces a person whose position does not require explanation. And Lady Vivian's gaze moved to Henrietta's face, with the smooth precision of someone who has been thinking about this moment for some time. Miss Wendwood, she said, in a voice of warm, social neutrality. I had not expected to find you here. You were aware of my position, Henrietta said, which was not rude, merely exact. Something in Lady Vivian's expression shifted at the precision of it. A micro-adjustment, a slight recalibration of the warmth. Of course, she said. I simply meant that the county has heard very little from Old Croft this season. One is always grateful to find the household so thoroughly occupied. She stayed 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, she said nothing that was not perfectly civil, and nothing that was not precisely aimed. She inquired after the library's progress, with a warmth that suggested she found it charming, and used the word charming 3 times in 4 different constructions. She spoke of the season in London, with the casual fluency of someone making clear that it was her world and not Henrietta's. She did not once address anything that could be characterised as an accusation, which meant that the entire visit was an accusation. A sustained, impeccably mannered demonstration that Henrietta's presence at Old Croft was visible, documented, and under assessment by people with the means to assess it. When she stood to leave, she set her calling card on the table beside the tea service. Cream paper, printed in London. Not a local card, but the card she used in town. with the Grosvenor Street address embossed beneath the fox crest. A reminder, addressed to no one in particular, of where the weight of things was distributed. At the door, she turned back to Lady Perseus, with a smile that had been freshly composed since the one before it. "Dear Lady Perseus," she said, "you look so very well. Old Croft suits you. It always has." The door closed. Lady Perseus looked at the calling card on the table. She did not touch it. "Remove that," she said to Jenkins, who had appeared in the doorway, with the timing of a man who had been standing just outside it, and he removed it. "She knows," Lady Perseus said to Henrietta, when Jenkins had gone. "Not what Linus has precisely, but that he has something. She came to see how much you know and how much you are worth to him, which are the same question from her point of view." The old woman's thumb moved once across the brass clasp of the leather volume. "You are, of course, worth considerably more than she is prepared to find convenient." Henrietta sat down again in the chair across from her. The fire in the south parlour was burning with its usual good consistency, the sachets of lavender releasing their slow warmth. She was aware of a quality of alertness in herself that she recognised from the months in London when resources were contracting and each calculation had to be made without the buffer of error. A sharpening of attention, a clearing of peripheral noise. "What will she do?" Henrietta asked. "She has already done the first thing," Lady Perseus said. "She came here. She confirmed what she suspected. Now she will move to the second thing, which will be legal rather than social, because the social route has been tried, and you are still in this house." A pause. "She cannot afford for the documents to become public." Her husband arranged a great deal of his family's continued comfort on the foundation of a reputation that the documents would dismantle. The house in Grosvenor Street, the income from 3 properties in Dorset, the position her son holds in the Foreign Office. All of it rests on Sir Gerald Cranford having been a man of probity in his business dealings, and none of it survives the alternative reading. Henrietta thought about this with the systematic care it required. Then she will try to prevent him from producing them. She will try to make the cost of producing them high enough that it seems not worth the effort. Lady Perseus looked at her directly. "You are part of that calculation, Miss Wendwood. You understand this." She did understand it. She went back to the library and stood at the north window and looked at the elm whose upper branches had, in the intervening weeks, put out proper buds now, small, tight, pale green against the early March sky. The whole tree changed in aspect without having made any announcement about it. She stood there for a long time. The bowl of dried lavender on the shelf behind her sent its faint warmth into the room, and the catalogue she had been building for 6 weeks lay open on the reading table, in its 4 colours, plus her own 5th red, and the dark oak box was on the lower shelf, where it had been since the evening he had retrieved the scores. She had been thinking, since Mrs. Ashby's revelation in the linen room, about the shape of what she was doing here. She had told herself, in the careful accounting manner she had inherited from her father, that it was work, real work, genuinely needed, fairly compensated. She had told herself that the debt was the Duke's business, and not hers to resolve. She had told herself that the warmth of this house, the fire lit at dawn, the folded rug, the card in her pocket, none of these were obligations. They were given things, not owed ones. She had been telling herself this for 6 weeks. And Lady Vivian Cranford had come and sat for 40 minutes in the south parlour and dismantled the premise with a series of civil inquiries and 1 calling card. Because Henrietta could calculate. She had grown up calculating in a house where calculation was the difference between comfort and its absence. And the calculation here was plain. If she stayed, Lady Vivian would use her presence to justify a legal action that would keep the Duke's documents locked away from public record for years while the courts deliberated. If she left, There was no visible connection between the Duke's private case and the woman his household had employed, and the legal avenue lost its most convenient target. There was, of course, another variable she was not supposed to have. The debt was not supposed to be something she knew about. She was supposed to be simply a cataloguer, a person of education and good judgment, as the three-line letter had put it, hired for a practical purpose and not for the private history underneath it. The Duke had managed the arrangement so that she would never have to receive what he owed her as charity, because her father's dignity had mattered, and he had understood that. And she had understood that he understood it. And for 6 weeks, they had both carried the understanding in silence and conducted themselves accordingly. And it had been, she found the right word carefully, it had been very fine. The most specifically fine thing she had encountered in years. She picked up her pen, set it down, picked it up again. She went to the study. She had not been to the study before. The door was closed, as it generally was. She knocked once, and his answer was a silence that was different in quality from his ordinary silence. A listening silence, rather than an absence. She opened the door. The room was smaller than she had imagined, a working room rather than a reception room. The desk substantial and plain, the shelves behind it utilitarian, the fire burning low in a grate that had been tended at some point in the morning and not since. He was at the desk, with papers spread before him, and he had been writing. The pen was still in his hand, but he had stopped. He looked up when she entered. She saw, on the desk before him, the papers she had known were being assembled without knowing what they looked like. They were many. Not a tidy file, but the working accumulation of an ongoing effort. Pages covered in different hands. Some folded and refolded along old creases. One on what appeared to be very old paper that had browned at the edges and been carefully preserved from further deterioration. Among them, in the top layer, she saw a column of figures in a hand she knew. Her father's hand. The ink stain at the base of the forefinger had pressed a small smear into the paper at the first entry, and she recognized the smear before she recognized the writing, because she had been seeing it since childhood. She looked at the paper for a moment. Then she looked up. "I came to tell you something," she said, "and I would rather say it before I lose the particular clarity I have at the moment." She kept her hands at her sides. "Lady Vivian Cranford came this afternoon. Lady Perseus has explained her likely next move, and I understand it. I want you to know that I am willing to leave Old Croft, if my leaving removes the mechanism she intends to use. I will not be the reason those papers stay locked away another 10 years. He had set down his pen. "Mrs. Ashby told me the full account," she said, because the POV clarity of this moment required it. Because it mattered that he knew she was not operating in the dark. That she had not been deceived into staying. That whatever she had felt in this house for 6 weeks, she had felt with her eyes open and the full knowledge of its origins. "In February. I have known since then. I should have said so earlier, and I did not, because I was still working out what it meant, and I did not want to say it wrong." She paused. "I know you meant it as something other than charity, I know that. But it began as a debt you believed you owed my father, and I will not have it become the instrument of Lady Vivian's argument against you." He stood up. He was across the desk from her, and he was looking at her with an expression that had shed the last of its careful architecture. Not the dawn face, not the doorway face, but something further back than either of those. Something that had been there before the 10 years of silence and had survived them, compressed and unchanged. He said, "No." The word came out as though it had been a long time without air, not loud, not broken, but rough at its edges in the way of a voice that has not been used and is discovering but it is still capable. A single syllable. She felt it in the room the way you feel a chord struck after a long silence. Not just with hearing, but with the whole surface of attention. He cleared his throat, once, with the slight, involuntary effort of a person re-establishing an instrument. And then he continued. "It is not a debt," he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined it, measured, as though he was choosing the pace with care, as though the words were things he was setting down rather than releasing. "It has not been a debt since the second morning in this library." A pause of 4 or 5 seconds. "I told myself it was a debt because I required a reason I could stand in front of you and offer without asking you to weigh it against something I had no right to ask you to weigh. I am a coward. That is a plain statement of fact and not a false humility. I let the arrangement serve as its own explanation because the honest explanation frightened me considerably more." He looked at the papers on his desk, then at her. "I will not let you go. Not on this account. Not on any account Lady Vivian Cranford can raise, because she has been building on a foundation that is about to be removed." He paused again, as though gauging the adequacy of what he had said. "I have been writing to London since February. The documents are copied, and the copies are held by 3 separate parties. Whatever legal obstruction she attempts, the original record is no longer the only one. She cannot recover them now. What she can do is delay and inconvenience, and damage by insinuation, and I intend to remove that option as well." The fire in the study had burned to coals. The room was warm enough regardless, as rooms become when they have been occupied by a person who is thinking with sustained intensity over many hours. Henrietta stood with the full weight of what he had said, and felt the word, the first word, rough and low, that single syllable, settle into the room alongside all the cards and slips and underlined couplets and fires lit at dawn, and understood that they had all been the same word, said in the only medium available to him at the time. "The second morning," she said. "The scores." He said, "Yes." She had stood in the library with the manuscript page held up against the fading light, and he had come and stood in the doorway and looked at her as though she had returned from a long absence, and she had not understood then what the look held. She understood it now. "What happens next?" she asked. He looked at the papers on his desk, her father's handwriting visible at the top, the ink smear at the forefinger's base. "There is an assembly at the end of the month," he said. "The spring assembly. The county will be there." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. She looked at the papers and at the man standing behind them, who had found his voice in a small room with coals in the grate and nobody watching. And she thought about the word public and what it would cost him and what it would cost her if he did not. Outside the study window, the March wind was up, moving through the elm at the garden's east end, and in the last of the day's light, the new buds on its upper branches caught and held a thin green brightness, the whole tree on the edge of a season it had not quite declared yet. Everything present, nothing yet open, the moment before. The carriage left Old Croft at 6:30, with Lady Perseus installed in the right-hand seat under 3 rugs, and a composure that indicated she intended to arrive at the spring assembly as she had arrived at every spring assembly in the past 40 years, on her own terms and ahead of the people she wished to observe. Henrietta sat across from her, and the Duke rode alongside on the grey, because the evening was mild enough for it, and because, she understood, there were things he needed the open air for before he could enter a room of 200 people and do what he was going to do. The March evening had turned extraordinary in the quiet way that March evenings sometimes manage. The sky above the lane a deep, washed blue. The hedgerows on either side exhaling the first particular smell of warming earth. Something green and mineral under the usual scents of horse and road. She had not been in this lane at dusk before. It was different from the winter version. Same stone walls, same turns, but the dimensions had changed, opened outward, as though the cold had been contracting things, and the warmth was returning them to their actual size. Through the carriage window, she watched the grey moving steadily in the blue evening. And on the grey, the Duke, his back straight, his hands easy on the reins. And she did not look away. Lady Perseus did not speak on the journey. She sat with her leather-bound volume held in her lap, not reading, as she rarely read in moving carriages, simply holding it, as she held it when she needed the steadying weight of a thing she trusted. Once, on the last curve before the town, she looked at Henrietta directly, and the look said something she would not put into words, and Henrietta received it as it was given, and nodded once. The assembly rooms announced themselves from 100 yards away by sound alone. The gathered murmur of a large gathering at its pre-entertainment pitch. Voices overlapping into a general warm resonance that came through the building's high windows, which had been opened for the first time this season. A crack of air at the top of each tall sash. Spring admitted into the room in narrow strips. Someone had brought flowers for the occasion, which they had not done in February. Bunches of early daffodils in the deep window ledges, their yellow so sharp against the old plaster that it seemed almost a noise. The smell of beeswax from the chandeliers, and underneath it the new flower smell. And the particular human warmth of 200 people gathered in their best clothes in a room that had held such gatherings for 50 years. They entered together, Lady Perseus on the Duke's arm, Henrietta a half-step behind. She was wearing the dark grey silk again, altered again, the ivory button pin in her hair. She had considered whether to change it for something less personal, and had decided against. It was her father's button. She would wear it. The room did not fall silent for their entrance. That was not the kind of room it was. And this was not that moment. The moment came later. She was standing near the east window with a cup of tea she had collected for Lady Perseus and not yet delivered, when she became aware of a small face looking down at her from the gallery above. The gallery ran along the room's north wall at a height of perhaps 20 feet, a narrow balcony with an iron railing used for the musicians when there was dancing, and at this particular moment occupied by 3 musicians in an interval of tuning, and one girl of about 12 in a white dress with a blue sash, who had clearly discovered that she could see everything from this position, and had the alert, comprehensive attention of a person making the most of a rare vantage. She was a dark-haired girl with the angular, long-limbed look of someone who had recently grown and had not yet quite caught up with herself, and she was looking at Henrietta with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who has been told something and is now assessing whether the person matches the account. When she caught Henrietta looking up at her, she did not look away. She gave a small, serious nod as though confirming a private theory, and then turned her attention back to the room below. Henrietta delivered Lady Perseus her tea and returned to the east window, and from there she watched the room arrange itself, and from there she saw Lady Vivian Cranford arrive. She had come with her son, a man of 30, in diplomatic black, his expression wearing the permanent, slight distance of someone who has learned to treat his family's social engagements as professional obligations. He steered his mother toward the far end of the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who knows her preferred position. Lady Vivian settled, greeted 6 people in 6 minutes with the warm exactitude of a practiced performer, and directed one measuring look across the room to the Duke, who was standing with 2 men Henrietta did not recognize and had his back to her. He did not turn. Henrietta understood, from this, that he already knew exactly where in the room each principal was standing. He had been mapping the room since they entered. What Lady Vivian did not know, what Henrietta knew she did not know, was the full extent of what the Duke now held. She knew he had documents. She had spent 6 weeks since her visit to Old Croft calculating how to prevent them from being effective, and the calculation had led her to a legal action that was intended to tie the matter in question for years, and she believed she had the time for that action to take effect before anything became public. She did not know that copies existed with 3 separate parties in London. She did not know that one of those parties was a solicitor retained specifically for this purpose, and another was the county's own magistrate, to whom a private letter had been sent the previous week. She knew the documents existed. She did not know they had already left the box. This was the state of the room's information when the Duke set down his glass and stood up. He had been seated at the far end of the room in the company of the 2 men, and the act of standing was not theatrical. He simply rose, as a person rises when they have decided to do a thing, with no supplementary gesture. But something in the quality of that stillness, concentrated and absolute, communicated itself to the nearest conversations first and then outward through the room in a wave that took perhaps 30 seconds to travel the full length of the space. The voices did not all stop at once. They stopped in sequence, nearest first. A human domino that left the room by the time he had crossed to the speaking position near the central hearth, in a silence of a kind that a room does not achieve under social pressure, but only under genuine collective attention. It was not the silence of a room that has been told to be quiet. It was the silence of a room that has stopped of its own accord because something is happening that it does not want to miss. His voice, when it came, had the quality she had first heard in the study, the measured care of a person choosing pace as they go, setting words down rather than releasing them, but larger now, shaped for a room, carrying without being raised, because a voice with that quality of internal steadiness does not need volume to fill space. The county stood and listened the way people listen to something they did not expect to hear, with the particular stillness of attention that has suspended its other operations. He did not open with an apology or a preface. He named Sir Gerald Cranford, stated the nature of the investment, and stated the falsity of the accounts that had attached to Philip Wendwood's name for 9 years. He held up the packet of papers, not dramatically, not like a man producing a surprise, but like a man setting an item on a table so that everyone can see it is real. He said that copies were held by 3 parties whose names he gave, including the magistrate who was present and made a small, confirming inclination of his head from his position near the window. He said that the original documents would be available to any interested party through the solicitor retained for the purpose, and he gave the name and the Chancery Lane address. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. He did not look at Lady Vivian while he spoke. He did not need to. The room remained silent for the 4 minutes and for several seconds after. And in those seconds, Henrietta was aware of a number of things at once. The warmth of the daffodil smell above the beeswax, the thin creak of the gallery railing as the girl above shifted her weight, the fact that Lady Perseus, from her chair near the fire, had not moved at all, but was looking at the Duke with an expression of such concentrated, private relief that it was almost too large for a public room. She was also aware of Lady Vivian. She saw her stand, one smooth, controlled motion, and speak a brief word to her son, and take his arm, and they walked to the door together at a pace that was not hurried, because hurrying would have conceded something that the posture of the exit was designed to deny. The door closed. The son's face, as they passed, had gone the careful blank of a man managing a situation he had not been fully briefed on, and may not have wished to be. The room found its voice again in segments, the conversations restarting as they had stopped, outward from the centre, the human wave reversing direction. Not the same conversations, different ones. He crossed the room to her. It was not a short crossing. The room was long, and he came the full length of it, which meant that everyone who had just heard his voice now watched him walk toward the woman in dark grey standing at the east window. I understood, in the plain way that 200 people in a room can understand a thing simultaneously, what the crossing meant. She did not move toward him. She stood and waited, because she was done with the habit of making herself smaller than she was, and she let him come the full distance. He stopped beside her. He did not speak. He did not need to speak. He turned to face the room and stood there, not performing, not announcing, simply present beside her, with the full public weight of the county's attention on the fact of his standing there. Lady Perseus, from her chair, lifted her cup of tea with the small, precise satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something for a long time. Above, in the gallery, a girl in a white dress with a blue sash watched with her elbows on the railing and her chin in her hands, her dark eyes moving from the man to the woman and back again. And something in her expression settled into the particular quiet of a person who has just seen a thing resolve, that they had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, to see resolved. The library at grey hour had the quality of the library at all its hours. The leather and paper warmth, the north window's light now changed in character by the season, softer and longer than it had been in January. The last of it still present in the room at 8:30 in March, in a way it had not been possible in the deep winter. The catalogue lay on the reading table in its 4 colours and her red fifth. 6 weeks of shared notation that was, in every material respect, a document of what this room had been to both of them since January. He had asked her to come here rather than to the study, and she had come, and she understood why he had asked. Not the study, where the papers had been and the coals and the first words. Here. Where the second morning had been, and the card, and the scores in the dark oak box. He stood at the reading table. He did not sit. He was looking at the catalogue, turned open to its most recent section, and he let the silence sit for a moment in the way he allowed most things, without impatience, without filling it, and then he looked up. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to be precise about the reasons, because you are a person who deserves precision." He paused. "Not because this house needs you. It does. Not because of what I owe your father. I owe him a great deal, and what happened tonight is what I should have done 9 years ago, and it is done now, and it is separate from this." He looked at the catalogue, then at her. "I want to ask you because you came to the study door and said exactly what you meant, and you have been saying exactly what you meant in one medium or another since the morning you stood in this room and held a manuscript page up to the light without putting it down when I came in." The faintest pause. "You would not have put it down. That is who you are. And I want very much to be in the continued company of who you are, if you are willing to stay here. Not because you were brought here, or because the position exists, or because it would be convenient, but because you would choose it. Because you would choose this." He stopped. The last light in the north window was almost gone, and the library had settled into the warm amber of the fire on the far wall, the shelves breathing their familiar climate of old paper and leather and long occupation. She looked at him across the reading table, at the face that had been, in sequence, a doorway face, a dawn face, a study face, and was now simply itself. The same face all the way down, with no distance left in it. "Yes," she said, which was both the answer to the question and a complete account of everything else she might have said. They were married at Old Croft 6 weeks later, on an April morning of high cloud and intermittent sun, in the small chapel adjoining the house's east wing, by Mr. Withers, the vicar of Old Croft, a man of 70 with a scholar's slight stoop and the unhurried warmth of someone who has presided over enough of life ceremonies to know when one matters in the specific way this one did. The chapel smelled of cold stone and the handful of early garden roses Mrs. Greaves had arranged in the stone niche by the altar at 6 o'clock that morning. Their pink so soft in the chapel's grey light that they looked almost painted. Lady Perseus sat in the front pew, with her leather-bound volume on the bench beside her and her Norwich shawl across her knees, and her expression was the expression of a woman attending a ceremony she has been privately planning for considerably longer than the ceremony's participants have been aware of it. Jenkins stood at the back. Mrs. Ashby and Mrs. Greaves were beside him, and Bessie was beside Mrs. Greaves, and Bessie cried from the first word of the service and appeared to feel no obligation to conceal this. Among the tenants' families gathered in the outer pews, toward the back, on the north side, a girl in a Sunday dress stood on the bench to see better, and was pulled down by her mother, and climbed back up, and was pulled down again, and the third time was permitted to remain. Afterward, in the churchyard, while Mr. Withers was shaking hands with the tenants, and Lady Perseus was holding court from her chair, with the authority of someone who has earned the right to hold court anywhere, the girl came through the churchyard gate, carrying something she had clearly assembled that morning from wherever wildflowers could be found in April. A loose, unsophisticated bunch of wood anemones, an early stitchwort, and 2 stems of something yellow that might have been lesser celandine, the stems uneven, the whole thing tied with a piece of rough string. She stopped in front of Henrietta, with the direct, unabashed seriousness of someone delivering an important object. "I'm Lucy," she said. "My father is the tenant at the lower farm. I saw you at the assembly." She held out the flowers. "I thought you should have these." Henrietta took them. They were the particular tender weight of gathered wildflowers, light and soft, the stems already beginning to bend from the warmth of the girl's hands. "Thank you, Lucy," she said. Lucy looked at the Duke, who was standing beside Henrietta, and then back at Henrietta, with the frank, evaluative gaze she had deployed from the gallery railing. She appeared satisfied by what she found. She gave a small nod, turned, and ran back through the gate to her family. The card had been Henrietta's idea, and she had not asked permission, because she had learned by then that asking permission in this house for things that were within her understanding of what the house needed was a formality neither of them required. She had asked Jenkins to find a frame that suited it, not an ornate one, just clean dark wood in proportion to the card's dimensions. And she had written the 3 lines out on a fresh card, in the same compact hand, as close as she could come to it, and then set the original beside her copy and compared them, and understood, looking at them together, that she had been reading his handwriting long enough to have absorbed its qualities without noticing. The way you absorb a voice you have been listening to carefully. She put the original in the frame. It hung in the library, on the shelf between the botanical section and the philosophy, at a height that was exactly right for the average person standing at that point in the room, which meant it was visible from the reading table. The library is yours whenever you wish it. Take any book you like. No one will disturb you here at this hour but me. And I will not. She was standing in front of it, the morning after they returned from a week in London, with the afternoon light coming through the north window, at its spring angle, lower than summer, still carrying warmth. When she heard him come in behind her, the familiar step, the familiar quality of preceded silence, and he came to stand beside her. She put her hand on the frame, not the card itself, the edge of the frame, the dark wood warm from the shelf's heat. And neither of them spoke. And the library held the 2 of them as it had always held things, without requirement, without condition, in the full and specific company of itself.